How about
All
now?
right, it's 4:01. We have to. You can hear them now?
Can you hear us now?
Yes, he can hear you now. Is it coming through on the Twitch feed? We're just checking the Twitch stream, making sure it's coming through on
The
that.
Twitch stream.
And
Hey, the Twitch stream is wrong. I thought it was going to be on main room 1. Main
What'd you
room
say?
1 has the other session. Is this what stream is this on?
This is the new medium. We are learning on the fly. Hello and welcome to the Ethics and Privacy panel at IEEE VR. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a Slack channel, hashtag panel privacy, and you can ask questions on Slido, which is not shown behind me, but I pasted it into the Slack. At the end, we'll take a few questions from Slido, but we'll also be taking live questions from this Hubs room. So I'll be pasting the Hubs room in when it comes time into the Slack when it comes time for the audience questions. As a reminder, this Hubs room is being recorded, so keep that in mind if you have any privacy concerns with that. If you do join this room and you aren't actively asking a question, please remember to stay muted. With that, I think we'll get started. So, spatial computing capabilities introduce new ethical and privacy dilemmas. And as mixed reality technologies emerge into the mainstream, these issues are becoming more pressing. This panel will explore the many implications of biometric and derived data, virtual embodiment, and integration of physical world data. It will also address the many intersections with other technologies such as AI and applications ranging from ethics and education to its use in hiring processes. It's important that we're attempting to this
1,400 interviews, and specifically
bringing in this type of
Hold on.
technology into.
I'm gonna. The guy who is recording is not in here anymore. Should we wait or not? Should we just continue on? The live stream is.
I am
Stream is down.
live stream down, but we are recording on to very high res for later, so we can.
Should we
we're
just
definitely
continue
recording
then,
everything.
or because people aren't going to be able to watch it? But I'm just wondering.
Kyle?
I am watching right now. It's sort of up to you as your panel whether
He's
or not you want
back
to
now,
continue.
so
Okay.
the cameraman is back. So
Okay.
That's good.
okay.
Shall we carry on regardless, or?
Sorry about that glitch, everyone. We are back with our streamer.
Okay, I was saying that I agreed with Kent around the kind of issues around biometric data capture. We're introducing this into schools already. It's already there. I'm very concerned around issues of informed consent around that, and empowering teachers and parents and children and young people to understand what that means. Data as well as kind of algorithmic nudging. Students are being nudged in particular directions, or why, particularly with smart, say, intelligent tutoring systems, and we get to the stage where we really can't adequately explain because we don't have transparency, either because there's proprietary issues around algorithms, or the actual algorithm itself isn't transparent. It's a black box setup, and I do get worried that one of the basic things of education is being able to explain something. Teachers have to be able to explain something. Students have to explain something. But if we can't explain what this technology is doing and how it's working in classrooms, and how it affects children in particular and young people, and issues of bias, potential bias, then we've got a problem. And the second issue, which I'll talk about a bit later, but I'll flag now, is around the idea of regulatory capture. So I think we're in a situation now where, for instance, schooling systems are very cosy with big tech and little tech to a small to a degree, but mainly big tech. And the people that procure particular technology systems, XR technology systems, or others, really aren't getting independent advice. Systems and put them into schools. So without independent advice and without technical advice, high-level technical advice, we get to the situation where we just can't ask the right questions of technology companies in this space.
Very insightful. I definitely want to get back to that idea of regulatory capture, because I think that's a really important point that you've brought up. But first, Divine, what do you think that the biggest privacy threat is that mixed reality technologies pose?
Yeah, great question. And Kent and Erica kind of summed up what I was going to say about data. But I'll just take it on a different approach of not only like your biometric data, but also like the content that you're viewing. And, especially in kids and teenagers, they just consume so much content, and the content is then geared to them for them to become addicted to it. And so I think for me, it's just, informed consent, but also ethical decision making on whether you're creating a game or some sort of experience, to make sure that people know what they're getting into, and if their data is being taken, they know what data is being taken and they consent to that data. So yeah.
Okay. That's so it's interesting that you bring up informed consent, because the current paradigm of consent for, well, really all paradigms is notice and consent, notice and choice, where you're presented with a notice and you either click yes or you click no. Do you think that that really is accurately capturing and informing people? We'll start with Divine.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, no one reads the informed consent. You just kind of like download the app or whatever it is, and you click agree because you just want to get to whatever the device is, whatever, the application affords. But like it needs to be better. And so, yeah, there's some privacy researchers working on this now of how can we educate people on like, hey, this is what you're getting into on the app. And yeah, we're not going to give you just like paragraphs upon paragraphs to read, but here's a quick summary of like what type of information is being shared. And I think that just needs to be communicated better, and clearer to the consumer.
Um, Kent and Erica, do you think that there are any unique possibilities for mixed reality to maybe improve the consent landscape?
Well, I think with any like I think of an application like Rec Room, which when you or even like AltSpace VR, when you go into the VR space, it's sort of a spatialized way of trying to explain the code of conduct. And so, there's going to have to be translations, like whatever the rules are, how do you start to communicate that within VR? And so it's going to be very contextual. I think like when something is about to happen, like I think Mozilla Hubs and other things that Mozilla worked on, like when you go in, it's like, are you sure you want to give up access to your camera? The other side, so having like different tiered ways and contextual information, like, do you want to be able to be broadcasting this information in this context? The other side is the potential permission fatigue, where there's just so many different layers that you really want to go through that every single time you put it on your headset. So I feel like it has the capability to like do contextual stuff, but also make it worse, meaning that you have to jump through all these hoops even to get into VR headset each time.
I mean, I think one of the key issues that I'm considering now is really around digital literacy. So these kind of, long consent forms where you just click, yes or no, and it's mainly yes, really are geared not for informed consent, let's face it. One of the things we could do, apart from including this in a much more sustained way in curriculum in schools, particularly around, around data, what data means, data capture, privacy, and it is to, I think, offer visualizations of data to users. And I think young people and children would be quite interested in this, actually, immersive visualization. So if you can actually wade through a visualization of the data you're giving away and understand where that might go in a very embodied and physical and visceral sense, that's one kind of educational strategy or pedagogical means through which we can both educate people so that they can better understand what's happening to their data when they click, yes or no. I mean, the other thing I would bring up, and we can probably get back to it later as well, is the issue of scraping of data. A lot of tech companies just are taking the data anyway. So, there really is a regulatory and legislative issue here, which is beyond consent.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to throw in there is that I watched some videos of these philosophers debating about privacy, and Dr. Anita Allen is one of the founders of philosophy of privacy, and she sort of compares privacy as like this fundamental human right. And she sort of makes this comparison to slavery, saying, it's sort of ethically not right that we sell ourselves into slavery, as an example. So is privacy kind of like that, where us giving away our privacy actually shouldn't be something that we're able to do? And so there's a range of different opinions around like this should be a right that's protected, but maybe we need like for her perspective, a little bit more paternalistic governmental protection of that right and restrictions around what people can and cannot do. And then there's the other extreme, which is like complete libertarian, like you can do anything that you want with your privacy rights. In fact, maybe it should be treated more like copyright, where when you give a license to someone to use something, it's not an indefinite license like it is right now with privacy. Maybe there's a little bit more of an audit trail so that you could license out different aspects of your privacy, but be able to revoke it if you wanted to. But right now, it doesn't work like that. Once you give it over, it's like a carte blanche. You give everything over, and there could be some range in between. But I feel like in order to really answer this question of consent, you have to really get to the essence of like the underlying framework around privacy. That if we have as a culture everybody giving up their privacy, that means that if your friends are giving up aspects of privacy, they're giving up your parts of your privacy that you have no longer control over. So it's a little bit of a collective thing as well. It's not just an individual's privacy, it's also implications where you can leak privacy about other people. So given that there's a lot of different dimensions, but different perspectives as to even defining what privacy is and knowing whether or not you're on the end of the libertarian side, which is like you have control and you could mortgage away your privacy if you like, or it's something that's more of a fundamental right that we need like more at the level of the state to be able to help protect for us.
So
Yeah,
it seems like, sorry, Divine, go on.
Yeah, I think too, with privacy and informed consent, it needs to be like equally distributed, so equitably. So if I want to download an app, and I don't want the app to have permission to my camera, I still should be able to use the app, right? And then we run into that like, oh, you're not gonna let us use you're not gonna give us permission for us to have your camera, so you can't use the app, and that's not fair. It's kind of like what we're on Mozilla Hubs right now, and some of us don't have our VR headsets, but we can still view this through desktop, right? And that's how things should be. It shouldn't be just like hey, if you don't give us your data, you can't use this. It should be designed equitably. So, yeah.
Can I just say on the issue of equity, and I think that's a really important issue that you've both raised. And this is a social justice issue. I mean, people's digital literacy is variable, and it really is related to level of education. So there's an equity issue there. And I think, if we look historically at human rights frameworks, it's often been the right to bodily integrity, for instance, and that relates to somebody using your biometric data, harvesting your biometric data, so your virtual body is real as well as your real body. That is a right, a human right that's been fought for primarily by minorities, by women, and by queer people. And so there have been social movements around, for instance, particularly protecting the right to bodily integrity. And in some ways, we need, I would argue that it is a social justice issue, and we do need, and a human rights issue, and social movements have a role to play here.
I love that you brought that up, that this is a human rights issue, that regulation has a part to play, and that this really is a social justice issue. Because my next question is that as mixed reality is being deployed in applications like hiring and education, places where equity is so important, what ethical and legal concerns do we need to be keeping in mind? So we'll start with you, Erica, because I know you have a depth of experience here.
Well, I think the issue is how we use these. I think Divine mentioned it, how we use these technologies to make decisions, the transparency of decisions, how people can have access to how the decision making was made and on what basis. I mean, there are plenty. The history of AI, for instance, is littered with failures in terms of with discrimination and human bias. And I think one of the big issue really is around transparency, explainability, these technologies, and accountability. Like, where's the accountability? That's what I really worry about. In the end, I often feel that there's a fatalism in this field where people just say, oh, well, it's happening anyway. The technology is moving ahead at such speed. Kind of practices such as, scraping data without the user knowing about it and its uses. Well, it's already happened. It's okay, and it's actually not okay because we do have a right to be able to protect our privacy and to understand, what we're giving away and for what purpose. And we certainly need people held accountable for that, whether it goes right or wrong.
what types of mechanisms for accountability do we envision?
Yeah, I think if I could just jump in, the keynote today kind of talked about it, right? Like, hey, if we're gonna inform the future of MR, AR, VR, we need diverse participants. We need a diverse representation, and it can't just be designed for one specific demographic. It needs to be designed for everybody, and that's like equity, right? So I think for starters, just creating, us as researchers and industry folks, like making sure that when we are doing some sort of research, to make sure it's checking as many boxes as we possibly can, and not just doing something cool for the sake of doing something cool.
Yeah, in the California, they passed a specific legislation to be able to protect privacy. And if you read through the Oculus privacy policy as an example, at the bottom, it says, okay, if you're in California, you actually have a little bit more rights than you do other places. And so you can actually request a full accounting of all the information and data that they have. And this is something that is within the GDPR as well, like the right to be deleted and the right to audit information and to the right to be able to be erased from all these databases. So I feel like the regulations that are it seems like it's a good start for the GDPR. I'm sure it needs to be expanded out and be a little bit more robust in terms of what's happening with the biometric aspect of side of things, because there may be additional information that maybe there's a lot of the information right now on the web is you're typing information into a keyboard or maybe it's behavioral stuff. But once you get access to like eye tracking data and your heart rate variability and you start to get all sorts of additional information as to what's happening. And then even if you were to request transparency of that, imagine getting a big data dump of a bunch of like what's essentially like matrices of numbers that you have no idea how to interpret, right? You would need to have it within the full context of all of the additional software to be able to even make sense of it. And so there's all these second and third order layers of meaning that people can get out of this information. And so it's not only having access to that raw data, but also the interpretation of what it means. Like, what kind of psychographic profiling are you going to be putting onto me? Um, but I think there's a challenge there in terms of the algorithmic complexity of what the data actually means. You're not going to be able to have any ability to interpret that, even if you had access to it. So I find that to be a challenge for accountability because, I've been trying to get, Facebook to say, okay, why don't you publicly declare what you're recording? But right now, the way that it's working is that all personal identifiable information is able to be recorded. But if it's de-identified, then they can record whatever they want. And the thing that I've been saying is that the part of sorry, there was a message here to mute if you're not speaking. So I'm hearing, and I saw the message and I got confused. But the de-identified data, if it's out there, you could be able to unlock that de-identification, in other words. So there could be a biometric fingerprint on the data that they're recording that then you could be able to sort of make sense of, be able to identify people later. So that to me is a challenge with accountability, is because you have some accountability with the personally identifiable information, but the de-identified information is basically a big black box. They're going to be recording as much as they can and not telling you what's there. And then maybe over time they're going to be able to be de-identified, but again, that seems to be a lack of good interfaces and transparency when it comes to that.
Okay. So how do you think, like, so, two out of the three of you are researchers. How can we better integrate privacy and ethics as our research emerges into a mainstream technology? Any takers for your first stab at this? Divine?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a that's a many answered question, right? I think first, obviously, like going back to the keynote, diversifying participants, diversifying research, but yeah. Let me think about this really quick.
Okay, great. Erica, do
I,
you have any thoughts on this one?
I mean, I'd like to see this community. I think researchers, folk, I'd like to see us work in a space where we do that translational work. So Kent was saying, what if you get this big data dump? What does it mean? So it's two pronged. Can we develop tools or applications which explain to people the implications of giving up, what the implications of what data is, um, what happens when we consent to data, giving data away, how it might be used, where it might go, the types of data we're giving away. For instance, can we explain to people, develop applications that explain biometric data um, in more kind of embodied and visceral and immersive ways rather than just kind of letters on a page for people to read? So can educational applications that just your average folk can download and try out so that it can develop community literacy in this issue. And I think that there's like to use in schools, for instance. So I think this community could actually work and to develop applications for educational purposes. And the other thing I think we could do is to lend our technical expertise to lay people or to people in other industries, so that we act as independent experts in this space to equip them, to empower them to ask the right questions. And that's it, going back to the issue of regulatory capture.
Great.
I'd say
Do you
one
have
other
any
thing.
thoughts?
Well, one other dynamic that I just want to put out there is that there's a whole aspect of the economic business model of surveillance capitalism that is in direct contradiction to the privacy concerns. And if it's completely disconnected from surveillance, then we're going to still have this tension between being forced to provide this option of giving up and yielding aspects of our privacy in order to have access. And so I think that's one big aspect of this is, until there's alternative business models, then we may be still kind of tension, and maybe that tension will always be there. And yeah, and also, yeah, I'm seeing some notes. The IEEE VR streamer, if you're listening, there is a lot of audio coming through, and also it's sort of breaking up. The audio breaks up for me a little bit as well as people have come in. So hopefully that's not coming through for other folks as well. But yeah, I think the deeper dynamic of the economic aspect of this, going to the VR Privacy Summit, there was a bit of like a lot of academics talking about it, but until there's a completely new business model, then I think we're going to still be in this sort of tension. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get to that point. But if it's decentralized and connected, and you have a little bit more autonomy over it, or I think another aspect is going to be the regulatory aspect, because the third-party doctrine, as it is set forth right now, is that any information you give to a third party has no reasonable expectation to remain private, which means that if you have somebody that's recording your eye tracking data and saving it on a server, that means within the United States, at least, that the US government could say, okay, we want to have access to all of this person's eye tracking data, what they've been looking at, recorded and stored by a third party. There's no reasonable expectation for that data to be private. And that's basically a huge loophole for all of this stuff. And until that gets solved at either the level of the Supreme Court and the third-party doctrine, which is interpretation that is interpreting that any information you give to the third party is no longer reasonable, that has been challenged in the Carpenter case, which was around the cell phone location data. So the Supreme Court voted in favor for remaining some aspects of that data, but it's very piecemeal, and a sense of framework for all data that we have within virtual reality is going to, or biometric data, or it's very contextual, and so we don't have from the top level a way of defining what should be private and what shouldn't be. So there's a bit of like from the philosophy of privacy and the legal perspective that needs to be taken into consideration as well in order to like come up to ways that it's not just like the level of research, but the higher level, like societal level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Microsoft Research, Jaron Lanier, he's working on a data dignity. And so, like, how do we, the future economy will be run off of data. And so we know what type of data we're giving away, and then we get money for the data that we're sending out there. But like, there's a flip side of like, oh well, then does that mean that like the wealthy individuals are the ones that have privacy, right? And so we have to like think more about these new societies that I think are going to evolve from the technology. We're still getting some echo.
Yeah, I think it's from VR Streamer. I don't know if he's at his thing, but
It's not echo. It's too many people in the room.
oh, okay.
Cool.
Okay. Let's see. So while how can we as researchers best prevent the misuse of the technology that we create? For example, if we were to find that facial movements during a certain task were to predict political affiliation, or eye movements during a task predicted this, what responsibilities might we have? Start with you, Kent.
So the question, let me just repeat it so I understand it. What are the implications of that if there's like second order information that can be discerned?
Yeah.
Is that
What responsibilities do researchers have to prevent the
okay.
misuse of the technology that we're creating?
Well, so I'd say the way that this works for the front lines is going to be what the companies are doing. I'm less concerned about what happens in the context of the research. I'm more concerned about what happens for once this technology gets into the hands of companies like Oculus, Facebook, not so much as Microsoft, but the big companies that are based upon surveillance capitalism, that knowing and like showing, like as an example, as a research example, like what you're looking at with eye tracking data, you might be able to extrapolate what your sexual preference is. That's something that has been shown, and so taking into consideration as this technology goes into companies or goes into countries where, let's say, it's illegal to be a homosexual, the government could be able to put you in jail. And what does it mean to be able to have a technology where now that you have eye tracking data and be able to have access to that information, you could be putting people's lives in danger for either putting into prison or other prosecution. So there's things like that where I think what the researchers can do is to do as much research as they can to say, given this primitive of this biometric data, here's what you can do with it. And then that is the evidence that's going to be able to be provided to the politicians and the government saying, oh, well, maybe we should have a larger, legal framework around this. So I see it more in the context of how the research is going to be fed into the policy decision making, but also for the wider awareness of consumers, knowing that if you are in an application and saying, do you give this application permission to track your eye tracking data and use it? There may be a really compelling use case for why you want to do that within a game environment, but is that data, where's that data going? Is it going to be recorded? Because as a consumer, you want to be able to know, oh, well, if they have this data, now they're going to be able to potentially extrapolate all this additional information about me. And so that's I think a big part of it, as well as consumer awareness, but also the policy decision making.
I think too, like as researchers, we have to do a better job of not only informing other researchers, but like dumbing things down for the public. So putting things in layman terms of like, hey, this is a virtual avatar and it has the potential to change your perception, your behavior, your emotion. And like really making sure that the public understands maybe the dangers of that. And then as researchers, like it's our responsibility to then design or come up with design recommendations or implications to then mitigate like these negative aspects, right? So any part of technology, it can be negative, it can be used for the wrong point of view, but like as researchers, I think we have to make sure that we inform the groups of where this could be highly susceptible, and then create design recommendations to mitigate that.
Mm. So, I mean, I think it's interesting because we're talking about kind of ethical implications, and one of the implications of ethics is that that we, as professionals, whether you're a technologist or someone in the humanities, for instance, or health sciences, that we understand what ethical decision making is, and that we are equipped with ethical decision making frameworks so that whether we're in a university or we work in a company, we can work through the implications of what we're doing in real time to be able to think about uh, what could happen if we do particular things or create particular products. And that means actually educating ourselves on ethics. And there are many different ethical frameworks actually and philosophical traditions. And each of those will give you a slightly different answer to maybe what you should do. But at the very least, we need to have an understanding of kind of a practical or pragmatic ethics and pragmatic ethics of action. So, is what we're doing, does it have integrity? Will it cause harm? Does it respect people? I mean, these are the types of basic ethical principles that are embedded in human rights frameworks and that have been around since the Nuremberg Code. And we need to understand how to use those ethics frameworks in what we do. And if we do that, then we don't perpetuate a scientism or kind of this scientism um, kind of framework where we think everything with technology or science is good. We actually begin to question what we're doing in real time and why, and we can, as professionals, raise those issues with whoever we work and with our colleagues and with the public as well. And I think that to me is really key because for too long we've had that kind of mentality that science will save us and technology will save us. Well, guess what? We're actually in a place now where that paradigm is no longer necessarily true. And I think this we can apply this to technology. And I mean, I'm really interested in technologists and humanists combining knowledge so that we can get this right, rather than, as Diane said at the beginning, try to retrofit solutions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think that now we'll open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question and you're in the Hubs room, please line up at the podium and we'll take questions in the Hubs room. Otherwise, you can also ask questions on Slido. I'll make sure we have two Slack channels. Apparently, we have panel ethics and panel privacy. So I posted the link in both of them. So first we have a Slido question, and this is from Jenny. And it says, I agree with Divine's point about specificity and consent rather than just yes, no. Is there work in flipping the model so the consent is with a person rather than an application or experience? Anyone want to take it?
I think that's difficult to do because it's actually more contextual than it is to the person. Um, and there's actually a whole work on sort of contextual integrity of privacy, which is a whole framework that is one of the philosophers that is a very robust way of looking at the context. So I think actually the context is really what defines what you decide to be public or private. What you share with your doctor, for example, in the doctor's office is going to be different than the type of information that you tell a bank. And the information you tell a bank is going to be different than information you tell to a random stranger that shows up on your door. So I think it's actually privacy information and how that's private doesn't have to do with you as an individual. It has to do with the surrounding context that you're in. And so I know there's different contextual workflows we're looking at, and I think it's called contextual integrity as a framework for privacy, and they've actually got a whole logical framework and mathematics trying to suss that out, and you can kind of break down the different information flows in the context in that way. And for me, in my framework of trying to understand ethics, I think it is very contextual, and that there are these different, I guess, trade-offs, and it's impossible to look at every single context and do the perfect thing. That's what makes it a dilemma, is that you have to make these different trade-offs. You have to give up a little bit of your personal privacy in order to get certain access to, let's say, biometric data to be able to track how you're doing to do rehabilitation, for example. So that could be a trade-off between your biometric data and other aspects. And so I think that's what makes it so challenging, is that we don't actually always know how to make those trade-offs and what you're losing and what you're gaining. So I think that's where having a broader look at those, the cost-benefit analysis that is more context dependent rather than focused just on the individual.
Great. Yeah. We have another question from Anonymous that says, say we provide knowledge to users about second or third order info that can be extracted from their data. What happens when we learn about new info that can be extrapolated later on? As researchers, we should pull data offline, but who decides? Would you like to take this one, Erica?
No. I'll be honest, this is why we call it dilemmas. Like, it is really, these are really tough issues that need really deep thought. And maybe Divine's got some, let me have a little think about it before I respond, because I really do need to use my kind of ethical toolbox to think that through. Divine, have you got a response, or can I flick it to you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it is really complicated. I think in my research, and with my advisor and the people that I've worked with, I think going back to like Helsinki's declaration for like human subjects research, I think that's a good starting point to think about, like, hey, what type of research are we doing? What type of data are we, like is it ethical research? To go back to what you said, Erica, like, is the welfare of the participant of the utmost importance, right? Like, do we have respect for persons, right? So making sure that participants have autonomy and then rights to make their own decision. Now, when data comes in mind and it's like second or third order information, like, yeah, it's tricky. But like, I think just letting, like informed consent, right? So letting people know, like, explaining to them what type of data is then extracted. And it's like a continued informed consent. It's not just like a one-time thing of, hey, we're going to take your data on your eye movements. And then later on, it needs to continue, and people need to continue to consent to the data that you're taking.
So,
Yeah, I think.
sorry,
Go ahead.
can I just, so in ethics, we have kind of procedural ethics, which are a bit like, this is both in research and in real life, or surveillance capitalism, if you want to put it like this, where you have procedural ethics, where, you fill out the informed consent form for research, you read the information sheet, you fill out the informed consent form, or you're supposed to read the information on the application and tick yes or no for consent. But I think Divine's right. There's also another thing called procedural ethics. Sorry, procedural ethics and ethics in practice. And ethics in practice is where the people who are making the applications, who are maintaining the applications, who are using the data from the applications, actually continue to think ethically as they go. And to think about, the type of what they're doing with the data, or whether they're sharing it with others, and the implications of that. So it's both around understanding, getting the procedural ethics right at the beginning, but also what does ethics in practice look along the journey, along the way.
Okay.
Yeah, and the thing that I would add to that is just that virtual reality generally is the interdisciplinary fusion of all these different experts coming together. And Diana, I know we've talked about like, computer security and how your phones, if you're, just the vibration, so the accelerometer on a phone is able to pick enough vibrations up to be able to take that information and reverse engineer your password, as an example, just by looking at how you're typing on it and taking the accelerometer data and then basically being able to like get all this second order information. So it's going to be pretty much impossible for one individual to know all of those potential threat vectors or what could possibly be done with information, especially when you start to throw in there artificial intelligence that's specifically tuned and trained to be able to extrapolate very specific information onto sets of data. And so I think there's a needing to step back and cooperate with all the different disciplines who might have some stake into this, and to figure out as we move forward, like as the academia, like how do you get those perspectives from computer security, as an example. There's lots of people who are trying to do the the white hat protection around what are the threat vectors for the computer information technology. And I think there's going to be a similar movement within VR. There already has been, where given this set of information, what is the worst case scenario you could possibly do with this information if it gets into the wrong hands? So I think generally as a practice, you can, if you are storing data, recording data and storing it, then you have to ask, like, 10 years from now, if this gets into the wrong hands, then what sort of damage and if it's de-identified now, is there a way to unlock that data later? So maybe the best practice is to like not storehouse data. If you're done with the data, maybe you should get rid of it, because who knows what could be done with it later, because there's all these second and third order things that may have not been even discovered yet for what could be done with it. So I think that's a challenge, especially when you have artificial intelligence that's very specifically tuned. As a metaphor, I like to think of, like, we're here in a virtual environment right now. There could be ways of which I'm moving my body that somebody could be watching me and be able to record, how, like, with the bone length of my arms, and that's very consistent. And then maybe I try to be in a VR experience later, and that same type of information around my bone length that doesn't change. If someone has already recorded me in another environment, they may be able to de-identify me in other environments. And so there's stuff like that where, if you're in a VR environment and you start to record all this information, how can you then reverse engineer it and then basically come up with a fingerprint or a lock that unlocks if you get a hold of a bunch of data? Then would you be able to de-identify it later? I think it's really impossible. It's basically the P does not equal NP. So it's impossible to come up with all of those those threat vectors. So if they were equal, you'd be able to then essentially predict all of that stuff. But once you discover it, then you can validate it. But it's the amount of work that it takes to be able to, before you discover it, know about it, is just, it's a very hard problem. So that's part of the reason why security has to continue be this iterative process, because once you discover it, you can validate it, but that process of discovery may take time.
Yeah, thank you. Kyle, did you have a question? You're hovering suspiciously close to the podium.
I did have a question. It's just muting your mic and then unmuting your mic is a little bit more painful in virtual reality. The space that we're in right now, we actually, Blair and I debated whether or not this was considered a public space. And ultimately, we decided that this was a private space. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's being
public.
sorry, it's
yeah.
being streamed, isn't it? Is this being streamed? It's a public space. Will it be on YouTube or a Vimeo? Will it be the video be posted later?
Well, what if it weren't? What if we were just in this space? Does that give somebody a right to record? When does it become public?
Yeah, can I poke in? So I'm running a study right now on social VR platforms, and I consulted with IRB because I just wanted to observe people's interactions on the platforms. And what our IRB office said, going back and forth, is that since the platforms are not readily available, so you can't just, it's not like a public, you can't just type in, the web browser, whatever, go into the application, and then it's there. You actually have to sign up. There's some sort of like authentication, and so that authentication makes it like a private space. And so I would, since anyone can just kind of like log in and hop on Hubs and view the conference, that to me is not a private space.
They can't
The,
be in this room without it, but they can be watching, right? So I don't know if that's the same thing.
Well, here's from a legal perspective, if you look at the definition of the third-party doctrine, it says literally any information you give to a third party is no longer reasonably expected to be private. So that's sort of that's a problem within that doctrine, because that shouldn't be the case, but that's the way the law is written now. So any data, like, because this is going into a server, then it's sort of, by definition, the government could get access to it if it's recorded and they came and asked for it. So there's the Fourth Amendment protection there. So these are Fourth Amendment cases, the protecting U.S. citizens from unreasonable seizure from the government. And any time you give data to a third party, then that's quote unquote no longer reasonably expected to be private. So that's a problem with the law. That needs to cases challenge that, and the Carpenter case is one of the cases that challenges that. But if you extrapolate that out, then even talking to another person, then you're sort of giving that information to a third party at that point as well. So you can kind of, I think, but whether or not things are public or private, I think you start to then go from any room that's listed publicly within this conference, I'd say is a public room. Anything that is a private, like you created the room and only you give that private link to someone else, then that sort of has a private context. And then you could send, but if you put that link onto Twitter, then all of a sudden that private context turns into a public context. Now anybody can join. So this is why the sort of framework of contextual integrity comes into play, because it's very fluid. You could be having a private conversation with somebody and say, hey, are you okay if I talk about this publicly? Now all of a sudden what used to be private is now public. And we sort of negotiate that when we're with each other one-on-one, and we have to sort of navigate that. Journalists do that by saying, is this off the record? Then you assume that it's on the record. And so I think there's different sociological protocols that we have with each other that try to navigate that. But I think we're going to have to figure out what they are. But there's a legal framework that actually is working against us here, because the third-party doctrine says any data you give to a third party is not private.
And what do you do around consent if some people in the room give consent for streaming and others don't? When we've actually signed up for the conference, we've given consent for particular types of broadcast, and we're reasonably informed about that. But I mean, I suppose that's an issue, isn't it? I mean, we have to think about when we have large gatherings of people, what that actually means in spaces like this.
So what I'd like to do, we're just about out of time, so I'd like to end by asking each of you what consumers can do today to help protect their privacy in mixed reality. So we'll start with Kent.
Okay, well, one thing that I'd say is that I feel like we're at the beginning stages of a war. Like there's a war where there's companies that are just doing things, and we don't really actually have a lot of recourse back. They're just going to do what they want, and until there's legislation from the government, then they're going to continue to keep pushing on the limits. And for me, I feel like the biometric data is on the frontiers of that war, and that within the next couple of years, I don't know when, but eventually we're going to start to have consumer virtuality head tracking data. Now, where does that data go? Who owns it? What are the things that we can do from a policy level to be able to have some maybe broader protections? So for me personally, I do think that privacy is a bit of a right. We fall on the spectrum between, this is something that we get to choose, the more libertarian approach of you being able to treated as copyright or being able to license it out and get paid for your data that you're giving out. That's one approach. Or the other approach is, getting some sort of paternalistic protections around our privacy from more of a philosophic and legal perspective. And so recently there was an experience called Persuasion Machines that was at Sundance. And part of what they were doing is that you go in the VR experience and they had you sort of sign a release form, and without really explaining it to it, you were being live streamed. And so, demanding different aspects of, having informed consent, but also being explained. And then after that, I got so upset, then I went down this deep dive. So if people want to get more information, you can check out Persuasion Machines or the XR Ethical Manifesto.
Thank you so much, Kent. What about you, Erica? What can consumers do today to help protect their privacy?
I mean, I think we we need people to work in the space where we can translate what privacy means or does not mean with these types of technologies, with either XR technologies, and particularly around AI and integration of biometrics into that. But we need translational research. So there's a middle ground between the experts, the technologists who are the experts, and the community. And there are many different. The community obviously isn't one thing. There are equity issues there, equity and diversity issues there, where we can actually produce material, which can be any type of material, not just written text, but for instance, using XR or using other types of applications to educate and empower people. And we're really at the beginning of that. We really are at the beginning of that. And that means understanding in medicine, we have a thing called translational research, where people, medical researchers, the implications of their research is translated by kind of middle people. They're usually academics who produce a whole lot of curriculum material for health professionals in the field so they can understand what that means for their practice. And we need something similar, a similar setup around translational research in this space so that we can empower different communities and we can be culturally appropriate in that empowerment, and we can certainly influence school curriculum in that direction. So to me, it's about people who are interested coming together to act in a translational role so we can empower communities, and that way they'll make really good decisions.
Great, thank you. And Divine, what do you think? What can consumers do today to help protect their privacy in MR?
Yeah, great question. I think it's not just on the consumers though. It's like a cycle, right? So first, us researchers, we have to get our work out there and realize that, the average person is not going to read a 20-page research paper. And so dumb it down as layman terms as possible. And so get the information out there about, what information you're giving up. And then, creators of the content, the Apples, the Microsoft, the Magic Leaps, like better informing people about, what data is being taken. And then from the consumer side, just talking to your politicians and making sure that there is some sort of government regulation around data and around your privacy for MR. And so I think it's those three things.
Great. Thank you all so much. Sorry I flew off. My keyboard went crazy. But thank you so much for coming to our panel, and look for us around the conference if you're interested in talking more about privacy and ethics and mixed reality.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
It's been a pleasure.
Woo.
Thank
Why
you.
did I fly off?
And I'm we can still hear you though.
That's
I think
good.
you guys actually have a little bit of time.
Yeah.
The session doesn't really end until 5:30.
Oh,
we have
it
another
said
half hour?
5.
We
have
could
another
chat
half
for another
hour.
half hour, but you can also just chat, right?
Yeah.
Chat would be great.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any more questions in the audience here?
I'm gonna.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So, for people who who aren't really as well versed in these matters with MR privacy and ethics, what would you say is like a doomsday scenario in case everything just goes wrong?
A doomsday in the oh wow, well that's like Big Brother 1984, you know, where everything we say or do is recorded, and then thought crimes, you know, Minority Report type of style where we're starting to be prosecuted before we actually do things. It's sort of, you know, that, but also like we just, you know, privacy is about being able to have your thoughts before they're fully formed, and have an ability to kind of work things out. And without that privacy, then we're putting everything as a public context by default, meaning that there's no room to actually make mistakes in that way. But also, I'd say more along the lines of being tracked, and everything we say or do being recorded somewhere, and being having that be extrapolated against our interests. And I think that's the other thing, is that there's things that usually within technology it's trying to help us, but this could be basically trying to undermine us. To be like, imagine if you were to go to a doctor and the doctor could sell that information that you tell the doctor to an insurance company, and that doctor was making a profit based upon a diagnosis he just got you. You know, that'd be the type of like thing that would start to happen, is information that should be private being used against us when usually it's, you know, should be working for us.
I mean, Clearview AI is the beginning of this, really, or a symptom of this. We should be very, very concerned about what's happening with data collection of that company and its relationship to law enforcement. And it's not as though the doomsday is far away. It's certainly I wouldn't say it's a doomsday, but the undermining of our human rights is certainly here right now.
Yeah, I think not being able to control our own perceptions of reality without our knowledge. So seeing content, participating in things that you have no control over nor want. I think that's the doomsday for me. That's the COVID-19 of MR.
All right, I'm back and no longer flying around. Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry I can't read a schedule. Glad that we have more time to talk. We have another question on Slido. Say people would be able to set a personal filter based on the types of data they consent with giving away, preventing them from seeing services that don't adhere to their privacy standard, so they're less seduced. Would this be feasible? And I'm going to add, would this be ethical?
I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is if you consider privacy to be a human right, then maybe, you know, you can't, like I said, you can't sell yourself into slavery. And so maybe certain aspects of what you're giving up, maybe people don't realize the full implications of that. And if there's been a collective weakening of our concepts of privacy and what it means, then maybe, you know, we need more of that, you know, that framework to be able to help protect us. But that, I think this gets back to the contextual dimension and the contextual integrity, is that, you know, you're able to, you know, with a doctor who wants to help cure something that I might have, yeah, sure, like have all the eye tracking data you want because it's going to help me. But in data given over to Facebook and Oculus, that's more the context rather than the data itself. And so it's, for me, it's less about me as an individual or that data. And maybe it's like, okay, I don't consent to anybody ever having my eye tracking data. Then, you know, then that could be an approach, but I don't know if that's workable, because, you know, what do you do when you're in that doctor's office and all of a sudden you want to give an exemption? Part of it, is it opt in or opt out? That's another talk about, you know, privacy discussion that hasn't come up. You know, mostly you're automatically being opted in, but isn't an opt out scenario where you get a degraded experience and then you can make a choice to have more data to be able to enrich your experience. But that's sort of the opposite of how most things are, is that they give you the best high fidelity experience, but also take as much as they can.
Sorry,
I think it's
go ahead.
totally feasible. It's kind of like going back to what Kent was talking about earlier. We'd have to redesign our economy, right? and redesign how companies make money. And so it wouldn't be this. So say like I have no restrictions and I want to have all my data given away, then I can have all the content I want versus like me not wanting to give anything away. Does that mean that I'm now that I now have um less abilities to do things, less access to technology? Like it needs to be designed equitably so that, people who per se don't want to give away this information aren't at any less, any less fortunate.
So earlier, Divine mentioned that he had been consulting with an IRB about some research that he was doing. So while we're developing technologies in mixed reality, there are research protocols, there are IRBs to protect subjects and ensure the safety of everyone involved. Do you think that there's a need for a real world IRB, and how would we design such a system?
That was one of the outcomes of the Privacy Summit, is that the model for doing medical research, there's an institutional review board, the IRBs. And so do we need an IRB for privacy? Someone who is overlooking how companies are using our data and being able to, take some action. I think the biggest challenge to that is, what is the deeper regulatory teeth that that type of IRB would have? If it's just a private entity, what incentive does a company like Facebook or Google have to cooperate with that IRB? And what if they don't cooperate and they violate those terms? And so I feel like the challenge is, what's the deeper regulatory framework around it, and the legal obligations. Lawrence Lessig, talks about how there's like 4 different dimensions of interacting with collective decisions. There's the economic decisions, so money. There's the cultural decisions, the legal decisions, and then the technological architecture and the code. And so all of these are sort of playing off of each other. And so you can have the legal framework, but you also have to have the cultural implications and the people and how they're interacting with it. And then there's how you actually build the technology. And so are there ways to sort of implement it, enforce sort of a technological implementation? And then there's the economic issues, which is that, as an example, you could say, okay, let's have a social movement where everybody stops using this, and then that will drive an economic impact, and that economic impact, the cultural and economic impact drives some sort of change. The challenge with something like the IRB is like, how does it fit into that larger framework? If there's money incentives of these companies to be doing the wrong, then you would need to have one of those other vectors, whether it's cultural, technological, the code, or the legal framework, to be able to actually change some of that. So that's at least how I think about that. It's a good idea, but then there's deeper questions around how is it implemented and how is it enforced.
What do you think, Divine?
Oh, wow. Erica, your voice was maybe coming through really high pitched if you were trying to say something.
Oh my.
That is too bad.
No.
I think, Erica, we're hearing like a chipmunk sound come from your. I don't know if you would need to come through or.
Nope.
Might need to re-enter the room.
Yeah. In the meantime, I think, yeah, can we implement this? So I know a few companies that have like IRB like protocols in their research divisions. But like Ken said, it's hard. Like if you can have all the protocols you want, but if the company is driven off of making money off of your data, and maybe they need to make a unethical decision and get some research out of it so that they can make more money, that's really difficult. That's really difficult to implement and uphold. And there's no that's why I think like there needs to be some sort of like government regulation on on all of this, on like privacy, on data, like what companies are able to do, because they're not, and they have free reign to do whatever they would like.
So it sounds like a lot of what we're talking around is wanting some sort of regulation. And this seems to me like it's not necessarily mixed reality specific, although mixed reality might be perhaps um, a particular reason that we need it and we need it now. Would you agree with that?
We definitely need some, like, for me, there seems to be a flow between how Supreme Court decisions and stuff that goes to courts and gets, there's conflict, and then there's stuff that could potentially come from Congress that they're making a decision and putting stuff into law. So, um, but usually, like, we've talked about, Diane, on podcasts where things have to basically go wrong, and then they fix it with the legislation. And there's like a propagation where it still feels very early for things to kind of evolve. And I think what's probably going to happen is that things continue and people are going to sort of cross a lot of ethical boundaries. We'll see how those ethical boundaries are crossed, and then we'll try to come in and fix it with the legislation. I think it's really difficult to predict what the whole range of what those problems are going to be, and to proactively come up with those frameworks. Unless you come up with a comprehensive framework around privacy and then have everything driven from there, which I think is, again, a bit of an open question, which complicates everything.
I know that Erica has experience
She's right
in
behind
dealing
you.
with the. Oh, is she? Oh,
Yeah.
hello, Erica.
Okay, do I still
Welcome back.
sound like a chipmunk?
No, you're
You
good.
sound like
No, you're good.
yourself.
Yeah. Did you want to come back to where you were standing?
If I can navigate that, yes, indeed.
And then you can use your mouse to turn around.
Yeah.
So we were talking about some regulatory that it seems like we're all kind of talking about around the need for regulatory measures and how we need regulatory measures to protect consumers because the companies aren't necessarily going to put this. And it seems like we all agree that it's not going to be simply technical measures, and that there's going to be some part of privacy protections that are going to need to be regulatorily enforced. And Erica, I know that you have experience as working with your government. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, we do need regulation. I mean, different nations will have different approaches to this. So the US is quite a small L liberal, highly individualistic, um, interested in individual rights, and many Western nations are certainly interested in that, but they balance it with other nations might balance it with more kind of a social contract. So, and you can see this. A social contract or a more collective view of what is good for society. So I think it depends on the national context, the type of regulation, legislation that'll be enacted, although there is a lot of policy and legislation borrowing going on. So GDPR, sets up a framework, a strong framework, and other nations look to that, particularly where a social contract is where the social contract is strong in that nation. So in Australia, for instance, we do have regulation. We do have bodies, regulatory bodies that are supposed to oversee big institutions, for instance. Although what we've had here really is a history, as in many nations, of regulatory capture, where those industries or sectors, the regulatory body that's been set up to regulate them hasn't done so very effectively or well, or has succumbed to basically being in the thrall of the sector and taking the advice of the sector rather than developing its own or seeking independent advice. So any regulatory system has to be there has to be frank and fearless independence to it, and there has to be independent advice, and there has to be, for instance, from this community, researchers who are willing to stand up and give that advice to government, and to be public intellectuals on that. And I think that's a really big role for this community, for instance, around XR technologies and AI. And that means possibly not getting industry funding, which for any researcher is a really big decision to make.
That's a really big point to make. So to your mind, the best way to try to avoid regulatory capture, as you say, is to have researchers who are willing to stand up and be independent and possibly forgo those industry funds. Are there any other ways too that we as researchers can help avoid regulatory capture?
I mean, I think our role as researchers in this space is really, we have to make decisions as researchers on the basis of our careers and career trajectories, and the types of projects we're willing to partner with industry with, and the questions we ask. I partner with industry at the moment, and the kind of industry partners that I'm working with small tech. They're interested in doing the right thing generally, and they see doing the right thing as a marketing strategy, actually, in the ed tech field. So they see being ethical as a good thing and as being particularly important for education and a good thing for their products. But, these are big issues and big questions for universities. We know that there are universities everywhere that have been in the thrall of philanthropists and industry, and have done unethical things. So it is very difficult for us. I think we're in a very difficult position, but it's certainly something that we need to discuss. Both if you've got a lab in your lab, or if you've got a research group in your research group, and just as an individual researcher.
Now, Divine, as an earlier career researcher, what are your thoughts on this?
So honestly, my dream job would be to be like if the government created a separate branch of all just like technology related matters and be like an ethical advisor to that. I think that would be so cool, to think about like all the different implications and all the people who are affected by, XYZ policy, especially relating to tech. I mean, we all saw when Mark Zuckerberg was on stand and the senators were asking him questions, and it was like, who came up with these questions? These are like these questions are ludicrous, right? And so like the government is just so behind it. It needs to get caught up, and it needs to also be proactive, kind of like Kent said. And if the government can be proactive, then we'll have like data equity, right? Then we'll have like a world that, hey, like, yeah, I want my kids to play in MR, social VR, etc., right? So yeah, that's my take on it. But I don't how do we get there? I hope it doesn't have to be, reactionary. I hope it doesn't have to be like, oh my gosh, all these people's data is leaked about your personal information and what you do and like how you move in your biometric data. Like it shouldn't have to be that. It should be more proactive and I think just transparent.
Great, great. Well, we have a few minutes left for real this time, I swear. Um, so I wanted to get all of your final thoughts on just privacy and ethics and mixed reality as it stands today. Where do you think we are, and where do you think we need to go?
I think
We'll
we're
start with you, Divine.
okay. Good.
Yeah, I think we're at like, the exciting time where eventually we're going to get that killer app that introduces everyone to, MR, the consumers, or hopefully it doesn't have to be like some sort of pandemic, right? Where like now everyone's into virtual reality and VR headsets are sold out. But I think we're really close, but we also should be thinking about, you know, the ethical frameworks to design, like how can we design this to help everyone and not necessarily target a particular group, whether that be like racially, genderly, ability wise. Like these are the things that we need to be thinking about as researchers and industry folks. Um, yeah.
Okay, Erica?
So it's a very exciting time. I mean, if you go into social VR, it's full of young people and often children who shouldn't be there. But really, it's an exciting time to connect, to have amazing leisure experiences and educational experiences. I mean, we're really at a space where you can feel some excitement, and people are asking really deep questions about the technology and its uses. But I would say, it's not just about the design of the technology, although it's very, very important. It's about the design, how we implement it safely and ethically in place, in situ, in context, and we need much more research and much more collaborative research with practitioners around that, so that we hone our ethics, our procedural ethics and our ethics in practice for particular contexts. And we also need very strong governance structures. So we need to work together to inform those in power about what those governance structures should look like.
Okay, great. Kent?
Yeah, to me, I feel like the metaphor is that we're at a crossroads where we could go down a very good utopian path or down a very dark dystopian path. And the world right now is in the midst of a global pandemic. And the World Health Organization has said, this was preventable. We could have done a lot of things to stop this from happening. And what's been really striking for me to watch what's happening in the world right now is to see nation after nation that continue to make the same mistakes and to not take it seriously. And they're paying the consequences of that. So I feel like it's an opportunity right now for the world to kind of do a global reset because, this global pandemic is not the only issue that is happening with. There's global climate change that is also an issue that mostly people have been ignoring and not having either the economic, political, or cultural will to make a difference. And I feel like privacy is in that same realm where there's an opportunity for the researchers to make those arguments and to come up with the research and to show this is what you can do with the biometric data. This is the scary dystopian future we could be living in, and to come up with the actual data for that and to show it to the companies and to show it to the culture and frankly to collaborate with TV shows like Black Mirror and actually like have the data be played out as a narrative because if you see the dystopic played out as a narrative, then there's something about that we can more intuitively understand because it's hard for us to extrapolate so many of these complexities. But if the researchers have a role to be able to do the fundamental foundational research that then gets propagated out into other cultural artifacts, whether it's a movie or whether it's just journalists and get the information out there. And it'll be up to the culture and the politicians to decide whether or not they can act or not. And I would rather have an overflow of abundance of our evidence and arguments for this as an issue that's important rather than a poverty of that information. And whether or not the politicians and the culture care and they act and they respond, that is yet to be determined. But as the researchers, we could start to, and the research community here can start to do that foundational work and to get it out there and hopefully be able to wrap a larger narrative and context around it for why it's important.
Great. Well, I know that I've already said this before, but thank you all for coming. My ask for the community is that while we are creating these amazing technologies, that we stop and we ask ourselves, how can this be misused? How can this be abused? Can this novel eye tracking technique be used for abusive purposes? Can this be used to identify people, and are there mitigations Am I using this solely to identify people? And what are the implications of this? What are the privacy implications of the work that I'm doing? And just stop and think for a moment and think about the privacy, because once that cat is out of the bag, we're not putting it back in, and we're not going to be able to retrofit privacy protections back in. We'll just end up with a jumble of protections like we have with everything else. So we should really try to build these in from the ground up as we create the technology. So thinking about mitigations from the start while we create things is critical. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Wonderful. I've had a great time.
Nice.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience. We really appreciated you all being here.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And I'll be here at afterwards. My controller's died, so I can't move. That's the only thing. Oh, good.
Awesome.
We have, I believe,
Excellent.
3 different people recording. So we're going to do our best to cut a good version of this so everyone who couldn't catch it today can at least see it on video.
Oh, great.
Awesome.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Hi, Susan. Really looking forward to your keynote tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. I was listening. Oh,
Oh, well, that's good. That's good. I'm glad that we were
The,
supposed to have our panel
had a
in
talk
theory
with,
after your talk, but
on the
times
panel
changed
page,
and,
it didn't
you
actually
know,
have what room
it
was gonna be in.
happened.
And so I
I'm,
asked Claire, and he said, oh, all of
yeah,
these rooms are
but I'm
gonna be
looking
in room
forward to
one.
it.
And the other session was in room 2. It said it was going to be in room 2. So
for me to make sure I've got
the reason
everything.
why I kind of freaked out there for a moment is because I had already tweeted out that I was going to be in the room.
Well, hi, I'm
Anyway,
Diane. I'm
for the
from
room.
Mozilla.
Anyway.
Virtual handshake.
Oh, wait, are you talking? I can't hear you, Kyle. Are
Sorry.
you muted?
Oh.
I was muted and then I
Figure out all the
muted
different
because
interfaces.
Evo's mic is.
Yeah, we had to turn off the
Yeah, no, I
the
think
sound
Laura's wrong
dampening
about
and
schedule.
the sound fall off in
Okay.
here to make
Yeah,
sure
no
that the recording would
and
turn out
people is-
okay.
the attract
Oh,
to
yeah.
its
The
awareness
sound
was
in
a-
here
yeah.
isn't the greatest.
But we actually have the 3
Okay.
UI contest going on right now, so I can't stay. I got to go and
Okay.
at
Okay.
Yeah,
You want to
exactly.
go ahead over
That's
that and
why
see
the
what's
sound
going
in
on.
here is
Yeah,
kind
just
of
go chat here.
terrible.
Folks here.
But
So.
anyway,
So,
just
yeah.
wanted to
well,
say
from here
hi.
on out, this nice
And
about being a Monday, you know.
looking forward to
Yeah,
tomorrow.
for sure.
No, I'm glad you did.
All right,
This
cool.
is
You're right.
really,
All right, see ya.
this is really a great panel.
Great.
It's fantastic.
Oh,
I'm glad there's so
awesome.
much bubbling up around this.
Yeah,
gotta get
yeah. I've been talking
batteries.
to Kent about privacy and VR for ever since that privacy and VR
Yeah,
workshop that he mentioned a couple times. I think that was in 2018, maybe.
it was in the fall of the end of 2018, but 2018.
Hi, Dylan.
Yeah, yeah.
Dylan.
Were you at that too?
I was there, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. There were so many people there. I
I
didn't get a
know.
chance to meet everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, it was,
So
it looms large though, still.
yeah, it was productive. I would love to have another one once, you know, we're allowed to leave our houses.
I know, everything I keep thinking about, oh, it's like, oh, we used to be able to do that. Okay, well, maybe one day.
Not anymore.
Oh my gosh, I know. I know. I was actually fighting off
Yeah.
children for like half of this panel. Who were like trying to like hit my keyboard and do it. I was like, guys. So,
I would
Well,
love
it's
to
the
blame my
similar thing is
cats
that the
for
virus
me,
is
like
invisible,
just
and
randomly
you don't
flying
know
off
until
in the
it's
middle
like-
there, but like
and
my
it can
keyboard just went bonkers.
affect lots of people.
I have
So
no idea
that's I
what
think
happened.
an analog word similar is
blame
that
the virus. I blame the
it
virus.
is kind of an invisible thing until it's
COVID
not.
did it. COVID affected my keyboard.
I think I need a shirt that
That's a great metaphor, isn't it?
COVID
That's
did
a
it.
great metaphor.
Yeah.
It is.
Just-
It's a very apt and relevant metaphor at the moment. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been tracking all the coronavirus
Are you
news and stuff,
doing
just
your
sort of
keynote
noticing the
muting?
dynamics of it all.
Yeah, I
So
am. So
Yeah, I
And
guess
then
Right,
also
yeah,
the
that'll
part
be,
of the other
it's,
dynamics of a pandemic is that it
I
has to reach a
mean, no
critical
one,
mass before
I think
you know
everyone will
people
kind of
take it
enjoy
seriously
it being
wider.
a
And so I
moment,
think that's the other thing
honestly.
is that
Yeah.
it can kind
Like,
of fester as
it's a new
a thing, but
normal,
until it sort of reaches a certain
honestly.
scale, then
Yeah.
people
Well, and
you know
also
don't
like my
have the
8-year-old
will
was
to be
trying
able
to
to
my
act on it
headset,
as well.
so I got
So,
all these calls being like, no VR, put the VR away.
but
Yeah, I
It seems
think
like a
there's a
very
Oh
neat
question
gosh.
problem
with
to have.
the
Like
privacy
none
is
of my
if there's
colleagues have this
something that
problem.
can
See,
get people to
usually I
realize all
have
of a sudden,
cats
oh, this is a
instead
problem,
of
as
kids.
opposed to the boiling
And
frog,
so
right?
usually I'm knocking my
right.
cats
Yeah,
off
if
of my
there's
desk
any
because, you know, they're
single
trying to
event,
walk on
which
my
you'd think would
keyboard,
be something like the
which is
Equifax
problematic in
leak,
something like this.
Yeah.
but
And
I
so I'm
guess
Well,
yelling,
I think people's
Batman,
identity would have to
stop
be
it.
sort of stolen and be able to connect it back.
Well, I had a
And you
moment
know,
where I swear to God, he
there's
unmuted
things
me.
where it still
And I was
hasn't
like, oh my God,
impacted
I'm
people's
unmuted.
daily lives in a way
So
that they can
hopefully that
necessarily
wasn't
even
too
understand.
noticeable.
Oh,
So,
that
yeah.
was okay.
it doesn't
I
connect
heard
back
it, but
to,
I
oh,
wasn't sure.
privacy lost,
That was
identity
completely
stolen
me
in a tangible way.
with my 8-year-old.
I think people in China actually have a more of
I
a
thought
visceral
it was,
experience to that
I thought it
because
was
they'll
Erica
have
messing with
things
her
that they've
audio because that was
talked
where
about in
everyone
private channels like
kicked
WeChat,
out.
and
So
then
you're
government's
totally off the
surveilling
hook.
that,
Okay,
and
so
then
that's my
once
other t-shirt. Blame
then people
Erica.
are able, you know, go to jail or whatnot. Like there's actions that get
Yeah,
taken based upon
exactly.
these sort of side channel conversations. And so
So where are you
I think in
based?
China, there's people
In
that
Washington,
have more of
D.C.
awareness of that,
Okay,
the
sounds
implications of that
good.
lack of
I lived
privacy
in
and
Baltimore
how
for
that
7
plays out in their
years.
lives.
It's true,
So
because I do
not
remember reading
from
a
DC,
paper
but
that
my
there's a lot
sister lives in
of
Fairfax now.
people
Okay. Well, nobody's from D.C. as it turns out.
particularly in
Yeah, it
Black
turns out
communities, who
nobody's
will
from DC
talk about
except for
things on Twitter and not realize,
like
oh, the cops
people
have
in the
tools to
south of
literally
DC
monitor
and
Twitter accounts
Right. Yeah. There's a few. There's
for
a few, but
yeah.
for
we're all transplants.
messages of, you know, oh, we're going to be breaking the law at such and such a
Are
place
you
and
at a
time, basically,
university
Right.
or?
No,
and
I'm
not realizing
actually
that
at
those
the
are
National
being
Institutes of
monitored,
Health.
and not necessarily
Oh, okay,
putting it
sounds good.
together if
Yeah.
things do
I
show
should
up
know this
somewhere
because,
that
you
they
know, I
got
should
the
have like
hot
read
tip
your
Oh,
bio
from
or
Twitter.
something
please.
and
Right.
been
No.
prepared.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
although
Whatever.
that's sort of
I,
in a
you
public
know, I just
context,
assume
so
that
you know
everyone comes into
that's
everything
Yeah,
unprepared like me. So
it's true.
it's,
you
yeah, but
know,
there's
that's pretty
the
much
things
the
with
story of my
privacy
life. I
are
realized
more
that I
along
didn't
lines
even
of like
introduce
the
myself
ways
on
in
the
which
panel.
that you
oh, well,
like
you know
there's
who
more of
you
an
are.
algorithmic thing
I
that
know
happens,
who
I
I
think right
am.
now
I
that's
had
also
everyone
invisible,
else
you know, like
introduce themselves and I
you
introduced
you
the
get the
panel.
experience of,
So
you
I
know, being
figured the
categorized
panelists
in
are the
certain
ones who
ways
really matter.
and then
Well, your
getting
name's
certain
above your
ads
head,
on
so that's
Facebook,
Yeah,
good.
but you know, this
exactly.
is a
I mean,
similar
And
kind
I
of thing,
should
like
just,
trying to create
Mozilla. I noticed. I saw you
psychographic
earlier
profiles
today.
of
I was like, I know
declaring
who that
what your
is.
identity is and
exactly. So
what the
like
meaning is around that and
I'm
how you relate to that.
recognizable enough now.
So it's still, even
But
when it
I
is a
realized that like
transgression of the
halfway
privacy,
through and
then
I was like, oh,
the
nice work.
the actual effects of that transgression is
That's
still
okay.
somewhat invisible
But
because it's embedded within the
that's, I mean, that
algorithmic
is the
reality
one
that we live
good
in.
thing about having us
right.
augmented in that
Yeah,
way.
I
It's like a
wonder
big old
for
name
getting
tag
the
that
average
nobody can
person to
miss, and nobody
realize
has to stare at
the
your
importance
chest
of privacy.
and your
Is
name
it
Yes, I
tag
was
there.
about to
essentially
say
more
that.
effective to
Although I will say that, like
either
the
just
people with
show them
the pictures on
the
their
Yeah, no,
chat,
that's true too.
like
the
sometimes you'll zoom
results
in
of
and
how
I'm
your
like,
privacy
I
is
feel
sold, or
like I'm
just show them,
harassing
hey,
their
here's the
avatar.
portfolio that Facebook
There aren't any
delivers
social
to
norms
users.
around
Show
that
them
yet.
just an incredible amount
Well,
of
actually,
information.
it's funny you
I wonder
mention that
which of
because
those,
there was a
even though there's
poster
not
last
necessarily
year
any
at
consequence from it, I
IEEE
wonder which of those would be more effective at getting
and
people